Hello everyone, I'm Nicola Laurent, the Australian Society of Archivists President, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'll begin with the ASA's acknowledgement of country. The Australian Society of Archivists acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from across Australia and the surrounding seas and recognise their continuing connection to land, water, culture and community. Today, I would particularly like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land I am joining you from today, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present. We honour your local community traditions of caring for archives and culture through country, through songs and stories. As part of Information Awareness Month, we are thrilled to welcome David Fricker, the Director General of the National Archives of Australia, Julia Mant, a professional archivist and former President of the Australian Society of Archivists, whose current role is at the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, and Jason McGuire, acting as Assistant Director General, Government Data and Policy at the National Archives of Australia. And we're here to talk more about the National Archives of Australia's Building Trust in the Public Record Policy. So we will commence with a short presentation from David before Julia leads a conversation with David and Jason to further discuss the policy and its implementation across the sector. We'll then open up to Q&A from the audience. So please use the question and answer bit at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and we'll make sure that's incorporated into the discussion today. So I will hand over to David to start off this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and welcome everybody. And also, can I just acknowledge I'm addressing you all from the Ngambri Ngunnawal country. So if I can, Naji Njamali, Ngambri Gudmal, Walgalu, Walawaloa, Ngunnawal Wiradjuri, Majigang Yanibu Jandu. Paying my respects to the traditional owners of the lands upon which Canberra has been built. And we're another Ngambri phrase that we've learned here is welcome everybody to the National Archives of Australia. So look, I'll make this a very short presentation because I think all of us are far more interested in the discussion and the Q&A session that's going to follow. So ably and professionally moderated by Julia. Hello to you, Julia. It's great to be sharing a platform with you again. So look, if I could just very briefly, Nicola, introduce our Building Trust in the Public Record policy. All ASA members, of course, I think would be well aware that the role of us here at the National Archives is to ensure that the essential evidence of government decisions, of government actions, federal government decisions and actions has been preserved and maintained and kept accessible as Australia's National Archive. But ASA members are also very well aware that that essential evidence cannot be appraised, selected and transferred into the collection of the archives unless the records themselves are being made, are being kept and are being maintained in accordance with archival standards. And it's those behaviours of the officials of the Australian government that are the target of this policy. So this policy is squarely aimed at all members of the Australian Public Service and indeed all of the other entities and organisations that do the work of the Commonwealth Government to ensure that foremost in their minds is their obligation, their duty, their responsibility to ensure that records are kept, preserved and maintained for the future. And so this Building Trust in the Public Record follows on from our previous policy, the Digital Continuity 2020 policy. As the name implied, that came to a conclusion in the year 2020. And it provides a maturity model for all government agencies to adhere to in their records management practices. And it's basically collected under three overarching principles. Three overarching themes. One is that all information is managed as an asset, strategically, with appropriate governance and reporting. So this really does flow on from our DC 2020 policies to saying that information, so data becomes information, information becomes records. We can talk about that a little bit more as well. But we're saying that because records are the information that provides evidence for something, and information is a product of data that's kept and created by government systems. that all of that information has to be managed under an information governance framework with the same rigour and professionalism and the same accountability as we would manage financial assets, property assets, or indeed human resources. The second principle is implementing fit for purpose information management processes, practices, and systems. And here again, what we're saying is that in the IT area, all procurement has to have baked into it not only technological performance requirements and user access requirements and security requirements, etc., but it also has to have information management requirements built into it. And also that management processes and practices and governance processes have to include information governance processes such as sentencing, ongoing preservation, etc. So these things become part of information management processes, practices, and systems. And then finally, around reducing areas of information management inefficiency and risk to ensure that public resources are managed effectively. So what's that saying in a sort of a public service speak? What that is saying to us as archivists and records managers is that you have to maintain, you have to keep records. Keeping records doesn't mean neglecting records under this assumption that somehow we're going to keep everything. You can't keep everything. Keeping is not an accidental act, it's a deliberate act. And so here what we're saying is that we have to actively manage records, and we also have to actively manage appraisal and sentencing of records to ensure that we, across the government, we're not inefficiently managing or maintaining responsibility for records that no longer need to be kept, or indeed that are being kept in the wrong environment, under the wrong measures and in the wrong way. So all of that is aimed at not just a compliance target that the archives is setting, but this goes to efficiency and effectiveness of all of our operations across the Commonwealth. So they're the three principles, very simple principles under which the policy is constructed. And I said earlier that it's a maturity model approach, as opposed to our previous policy, which was the DC 2020 policy, where it was much more of a, targets were in there. You either succeeded or you failed to achieve targets. And it felt like, in some ways, it felt like a fairly blunt instrument, a fairly heavy-handed compliance instrument, as opposed to a useful resource that government entities could call upon to improve their maturity in information governance and record keeping and records management. So under this, we have a maturity model. There are only three mandatory obligations and requirements that are in here, and the rest of them are recommended actions. And so every government entity can, within its own procurement cycles, within its own budget cycles, within its own strategic planning, can adopt the recommendations along the way that are most readily adopted within that particular stage that a government entity is up to, and provided that they are, over time, adopting more and more of the recommended measures, but always adopting, having adopted those three mandatory measures, then I think we're going to see now is not a Commonwealth government which is sort of fighting against the compliance measure imposed by the National Archives, but instead we're going to see a Commonwealth government which is eagerly adopting recommended actions that improve business, improve efficiency, and are also maintaining their record-keeping obligations. So that's it in a very brief nutshell. As I said, I don't want to overload this with a detailed presentation. Much more interested in where the discussion will take us from here. So Julia, Jason and I are now ready to respond to whatever questions you may have and what we might get from webinar attendees. So over to you. Thank you, Julia.
Well, thank you, David, and hello, Jason, as well, and good afternoon to you all, and thanks for the introduction, Nicola. I'm speaking from Gadigal Wongal country in Sydney, and I also pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders, past and present. Thanks to the ASA Council for the invitation to join David and Jason discussion about the Building Trust and the Public Record Policy. And I should note that while I am now working for a federal agency, I am speaking in a private capacity with my professional hat on, not reflecting actions or views of my workplace. But I thought I would just give a shout out to the NAA's hardworking agency service centre who've been very helpful to me over the past few months. So thanks to you all there. So in actual fact, this is the third policy issued by the National Archives since 2011, and David set out that process a little bit there. And I guess the framework was to support digital transformation, and certainly that has occurred, I would say, in great part. There's still pockets to be explored by many agencies, I'm sure, and the new policy reflects some of the challenges that are out there, particularly areas around governance or interoperability of data and systems and sentencing. And these really inform those three mandatory requirements of the policy that David's just set out. I mean, I did think, David and Jason, that the policy was issued in January 2021, and it comes on the back of a lot of other policies and reports that have been out there. There was the back of the ANAO report from 2019 about how the NAA supports agencies, Vivian Tom's review for CARA agencies on government accountability in the digital age, which came out September 2020. Obviously, the release of the Tune review this year, as well as issues around access and the Palace letters. And it just seemed to me, how do you make space for the policy and the policy objectives within that very crowded space? It's not the only report that those few that I mentioned. There are many other ones with that. I mean, I know you've got an interesting one from the Australian Public Service as well that's there. So how do you set that policy focus within that? Are they interrelated? Do you see them, the Tune review coming later as a report that was out that informs the policy, or the policy, you know, is the focus aligned? Just a little bit around that context, perhaps.
Yes, perhaps I could take this one, because it is it is very crowded landscape. You're absolutely right, Julia. And in a way, it should be, because I think information policy is at a critical point across the Commonwealth government. And maybe in a moment, I'd like Jason, you to reflect on the range of consultations that went with the other government agencies dealing with information policy. And you know, with all of those reviews, the Thodey review into the public service, the government's response, the Delivering for Australians, you know, they had recommendations about you know, whole of government actions around managing government data. It's mainly what the context was there. But the Vivian Tom's report that we commissioned through CARA, and of course the Tune review, all did point to. Look, tipping point is an overused term at the moment, but they all point to that we are at a very important stage in the proper stewardship and management of government information, because perhaps we have let it get too fragmented across government, because we've been so obsessed with data and data management, and so obsessed with digital and everything digital, that we can tend to lose sight of the information in the middle of all of that. You know, that really, the reason data is important is because it gives you insights, because it gives you a capability to make better decisions and to be held accountable, et cetera, et cetera. And so for us, this policy was our attempt to, in a way, cut through all of that crowded landscape and to provide some clarity and simplicity around what the National Archives are talking about is, at the end of all of this activity that we're engaged in across government and public service, what's the residual value? Are we leaving a comprehensive, accurate, authentic, reliable record as the residual value of all of that frantic activity across the public service and all that digital innovation? But Julia, could I get maybe Jason to maybe comment on the various government agencies that we have consulted with? Because it might be of interest to you know, the participants in the webinar that information policy in government does embrace an awful lot of government entities.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. Thank you, Julia. And yeah, in the development of the new policy, you know, at the inception of doing the new policy, we were analysing sort of where agencies were at in their information management maturity as part of the DC 2020 policy, and the results were that, and it's interesting statistics, that the results say, 1/3 of agencies wouldn't have fully met the DC 2020 targets, which was reported on, but it didn't say 2/3 would. But it also identified that, there is more work to do and more advice and guidance, and DC 2020 was that digital transition. The Building Trust and Public Record extends from that, and a lot of the principles in DC 2020 are still in the new policy. In terms of the consultation, we did consult. We had two main groups. So we had an agency advisory group, which were a group of practitioners who are managing information assets records in agencies, and there were around 20 members of that group, which could really discuss, the tactical areas of records management. We then lifted it up because, as David mentioned, that it is a contested and congested space. That's what people would see looking from the outside in. But we had a round table of senior executive service members from the Attorney General's Department, Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Australian Public Service Commission, Department of Finance, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Digital Transformation Agency, Office of the Information Commissioner, and the Office of National Data Commissioner. So they're, and us as well. So we were the core information or data policy agencies. And what came quite evident was that we're all looking at the same information, data, records, but through a different lens. There was a digital transformation to deliver digital services for the benefit of Australians. That's the Digital Transformation Agency focus. Improving the Australian government's capability to maximise the sharing of public sector data. So this comes into that reduce areas of information management, efficiency and risk, because that's the Office of National Data Commissioner, where that's about the use and reuse and sharing of data across government. Obviously noting privacy principles, and they have to have a data sharing agreement between each other before they do that. So that's that lens. Delivering quality statistical services and trusted data for statistics. That's where the Australian Bureau of Statistics came in. They deal with big data, a lot of data. And as David said, data becomes information that can lead to making decisions or policy decisions. So where do we pitch and grab that data? There's obviously giving effect to public rights and access of Australian government public sector data with privacy. So that's where the Information Commissioner comes in, with privacy and freedom of information. And then improving performance management of Australian government assets, and then, improvement in the workforce digital and data capacity. So that's the APSC from the 30 review, how we build the capacity of our public servants in managing and using information. So that was our consultation piece. And as we developed the policy, there were the core aspects, but we had to be mindful of our policy is for us to obviously identify the significant records, which is information and data, that's led to government decisions that needs to be retained as national archives for the current and the future. So that's our angle. And there are different angles from those other agencies, but our policy is designed to complement their policies. And our policy, it's a complementary nature back and forth.
But it's still confusing for people. So this is the work that we are constantly having to do.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It is a very crowded space out there now. And I was reflecting on this transition over the last 10 years and saying, well, really now, the way people work is digital first in many cases. That's not to say that some agencies don't still produce hard copy, but for the most part, the bigger ones will have moved through to that. But I think it seems to have landed us into a really radically different space for information management, not an unanticipated one, but one nevertheless that it seems very, very real, which is, has put a lot of challenge for people to distinguish between the born digital and the digitisation and what that means, both within agencies and I guess for National Archives for a challenge for managing the dialogue around it. There's heavy resources required to manage in the digital as well. The infrastructure, there's the new skills for staff capabilities as well as information management staff and their capabilities. And I think, Jason, you've just alluded to that challenge of distinguishing the archival record within the plethora of types of information that's out there. And it seems to me, I don't know whether that was an anticipated change by the National Archives 10 years ago when you started the policy framework to support digital transformation, or really in a sense it's a little bit caught out as well. And what the new policy is really trying to do is to say, okay, we've really got to try and gain some control where it is a little bit wild out there, and how do we strategically focus on what's critical? And perhaps that's where the building trust aspect of the policy focus comes into it there, because there is a great concern, I would think, that where will the archival record in the born digital space lie and exist, and will you have it?
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. And the building trust, it's a very deliberate choice of naming this. Well, two quite deliberate choices were trust, because we did want to sort of cut through that discussion about data and information and records, and saying, the reason that we're concerned about records is because of this trust issue, trust deficit that most democracies are feeling around the world at the moment, and is certainly evident in Australia. We also deliver. So trust is, yes, of course, there's a lot of discussion in Australia about digital transformation. There's a lot of discussion about sharing government data for the digital economy. And all of those things are about, or even for, dare I say, deriving, calculating national statistics. But all of those things are data being used as inputs to some sort of calculation. Whereas our interest is in, how is data going to be used to establish and maintain public trust in our national institutions, in our democracy, in our rule of law, and maintain our rights and entitlements, etc. So deliberate choice of the word trust, and also deliberately sort of to reclaim the word record, to sort of, because I think, Julia, maybe what you're saying is during our digital transition policy and our DC 2020 policy, in a way we were trying to avoid the use of the word record, because we were trying to capture all the CIOs across Australia. We were trying to capture that information management and trying to stop people talking about information life cycle absent of any sort of long-term thing. But in this case, we've said, no, record's an important concept, and record is what public servants have to be aware of. And so data is what computers see, and information are the insights that you can gain from data. And records, that information that serves as evidence is the record. And so we're trying to now be a little bit more nuanced about that, and again, getting people back to thinking about what's on the public record, because that, after all, is the foundation for people's trust and the foundation for our system of a liberal democracy here in Australia.
Yes. I can hear myself on someone else's speaker there. Okay, I might actually just jump. Fiona Tan has put in a question, which I think is pertinent at this point in the conversation, and that she's asked, is it possible to share a little bit more about why there was a shift away from a compliance model to a maturity level model? Was it because of the confidence level in the agency's ability to take on the recommendations voluntarily, given the other pressures for the government to be accountable, or the recognition that there were too many variables for a compliance model to be effective? And I'm thinking, Jason, that this might touch on a little bit around that consultation process that you mentioned already, hence bringing the question in now. Thanks, Fiona, for it.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Fiona. And I'll begin with the response, and then David might come in after. So, the DC 2020 was a compliance model. And that was probably fit for the time, because we were trying to bring agencies up over that 5-year period where they could look at the targets and aim for those. and to get that support through their executive. Then through all of our roundtable discussions, there was a school of thought. Do we go with targets and compliance? And there was another more resounding thought that let's do a maturity model. And we've got a 5-year policy period for this new policy as well. And part of the reasoning there was that, from digital transition, which was the original policy, then DC 2020, and now we're into the Building Trust and Public Record, is various different agencies are at a different stage in their information management maturity life cycle. So, we have some that are close to highly mature, and we have some that are not as mature. So what we're actually saying is that across the 5-year period of implementation, depending on where you're at in the life cycle of your agency with its own outputs and outcomes and processes, and obviously priorities, because people have to prioritise their investment, is you can, wherever you're at, you start at that point and you build up. And what we say is that if you, obviously there's 3 recommended or mandatory actions, which people need to focus on first, and then the remaining 14, as what we say is if you can implement the full 17 across the 5-year continuum of the policy, you'll have very sound and robust information management and practices, processes and governance in your organisation. So it was really that maturity model because of where agencies were at within their own cycle of their work program.
And if I could just follow on that, it also, because what we're trying to do here is achieve success, at the archives. We don't want to set up a regime which is going to immediately create failures, and then have some winners and some losers. Our altruistic goal here is for government records to be available and reliable. And the DC 2020, we were criticised by the Auditor General as well. That sort of pass-fail approach is difficult to govern. It's difficult to manage. It's difficult to generate a lot of good success stories and to generate more enthusiasm for further success. It's a much harder way to motivate organisations across the public service to succeed. The maturity model is much easier. As Jason's just said, no matter where you're starting from, it's much easier for you to get on board and make progress. And it's a much better way, I think, to motivate a passion, for success, to motivate some sort of, enthusiasm across the government to actually get on board and do this, because it will deliver business benefits. So for those sort of reasons, better governance, easier to manage across the varied entities of public service, and it should serve as a much better motivational tool to achieve success.
On an observation, the policy's been in place since January. We published it in November, but it wasn't effective until January. But what I'm finding and my team are finding is there are a lot of, we've got more and more government agencies coming to us and talking with us on the very fact of, we want to do the right thing. We know the importance of records management, information and data. And agencies are at different levels of that maturity, and they're coming to talk with us on how they can start to best implement the policy, but also with some of the key questions on, David touched on, where they have, algorithms in their systems that lead to a decision. Well, how do we approach that? How can we identify that as part of that decision-making record? So we're getting more and more people come to us and talking to us about that.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, David. And I just encourage the audience to send through your questions and put them through. I can see one coming through there because I will intersperse them throughout the discussion rather than wait to the end. So please do send through as they come to mind. One thing that I think Dr. Tom called for in her report was that greater clarity and certainty in roles to reduce conflict and overlap and avoid gaps in responsibilities for information management. And again, you touched on this in the introduction, both David and Jason, the many players in the public space. And I guess I just thought it was useful to think about the NAA's role, both for advocacy and leadership across government. And in the Tune review, there was posed a sense of a government information management model. I don't want to go too much into that, but I guess that interest in the thought of the NAA leading this at government, is it do you feel there is a good acceptance of that? Will that help agencies? Because I feel that some of the confusion is, well, I'm following this one, but I didn't know I had to follow that one as that, and there's too much compliance, and how do I navigate through the various, hopefully aligned, but not always obviously so to people in risk or data or privacy, how they all fit together. So where do you see the NAA developing, both aspirationally, but also in the reality of it?
Yeah, it was interesting that David did put that recommendation in there for the government information management model. So to have a line of business, if you like, within the National Archives, we would embed basically all the public servants that are currently records managers would become part of the National Archives of Australia, still embedded in those agencies, but it would give us the opportunity to mobilise that workforce as a professional cadre, and to then sort of move, that mobilisation would be more effective. You could then move teams of people from one agency to the next to do some focused, concentrated work on each agency. There's not a lot of appetite for it, I've got to tell you, across the APS. So, all of my fellow public servants listening, we're still not very good at reform in the Australian public service, and a reform of this magnitude in what is still quite a risk-averse organisation is going to be a hard yard to actually pursue. So short of that, what we've got to do, and David Tune also made a recommendation about this as well in his report, is we've got to do this through more influence, for us just to be present and more influential in those important discussions going on around government, around information policy. And one part of that is that we are currently within the archives advocating for us to set up a professional stream within the Australian Public Service of records manager. And that would involve us establishing a centre of excellence within the organisation, and under the Public Service Commission's model for professional streams. So while we can't necessarily sort of have those records managers as part of our staff, as part of our workforce, they can still be part of a professional stream, which is overseen by the National Archives. And that would be a way of sort of elevating that a bit more. As everyone knows, we've introduced the Chief Information Governance Officers as a requirement of DC 2020. We've made it a prerequisite for those positions to be a member of an association like the ASA to get that level of professionalism into those roles. And this Centre of Excellence and Professional Stream is another way of doing that. It's having that information management, records management properly recognised as a distinct professional requirement of public administration in Australia.
Okay, and there's a couple of questions that perhaps are reflecting on that trend as well. Roz has asked, do you feel there's a general acceptance within information management communities of the benefit of good IM to the business of an organisation is likely to encourage better management than the idea of necessary compliance? And Kirsten Wright has said, in many cases, the agency records manager or information manager is aware of the requirements, but others aren't. Could the policy be used as an advocacy tool for people trying to raise awareness of these issues within their organisations? And again, someone else has said the policy statements could be applied more broadly across the profession. And again, this advocacy aspect, which, I mean, I agree, having a records management profession, obviously, clearly, because I mean, that is the challenge, how you get the skills into the agencies that are the applicable skills for driving change and not seen as restrictive, but also driving that digital change, up-to-date skills is critical. So I don't know if they all fit together, how you move to this idea of information management, promoting it, if you'd like to reflect on that a little bit more.
Yeah, look, Jason, do you want to, maybe it's for you to talk about this one, I mean, because there is a real advocacy thing here, in the way that our checkup surveys are run, and we insist on the accountable authority signing off, etc. So maybe you talk on the advocacy.
So yeah, so I think amongst the professionals, there's acceptance that good information management and the benefit of good information management to the business organisation will encourage better management than the issue of compliance. There is an acceptance of that. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we find is that as part of the previous policy and the current policy in our annual surveys is that to maintain assurance, we ask that the CEO or the accountable authority of the organisation actually signs off on that. So that's bringing it in front of the executive, and if you're putting something in front of your chief executive officer and you're briefing them, then that raises that importance. The other thing that we promote, and there's a little bit of a way to go in some organisations, is having a good information governance committee as part of your governance structure. That's being put in place in a lot of organisations. Our next stage is that it should just form part of your normal governance process. It shouldn't be, oh, we're dealing with information governance, as part of your financial management, your legal, your property, your procurement. This is part of that. So we are seeing an improvement there. Yeah. The Kirsten's question, we have had some examples with some of the engagement that we have, is that the records managers or info managers are quite aware of the policy and the requirements, and we have been working with one particular agency, which I won't mention, where we did go and work with them and brief them on the policy and in the value of good information management. But they brought in they weren't their information managers we were talking to. It was their business managers or their directors of a business unit who are mindful of and understand, keeping good records and keeping good information. But we tried to link the policy, because they've got their overarching, we need to meet the Archives Act and the Building Trust Policy. How can that relate to the work that I do, which then improves the overall information management? So we are seeing that as a trend.
I think that is, I think all of us, Kirsten, your question does go to it. I think all of us are seeing that in the bad old days of the archives, I can say that, we had that Dirks methodology. The archives was all about, forcing people into very sort of specific, very long, very labour-intensive things which are of zero interest to anybody outside, the records area. And where it was discussed outside that area, it was just seen as this awful buggerance. And it is, as Jason's saying, what this is all about. The reason for the glossy covers and the swishy titles and everything is to make this relevant to the boardroom. To sort of say, look, in your enterprise risk register, every agency has got their risks sorted out, and up at a very high level is about trust. If there's a breach of trust in this organisation, if our reputation is so badly damaged, then we will fail, to exist, to survive as an organisation. And so this is what we are doing. This policy is very much intended to be that, and we are getting invited to come to the boardrooms and the executives of various organisations to talk about the policy in those sort of executive management terms. And again, as Jason's saying, this is what this is doing is helping your success. This is a key part of your strategic success. So it is trying to be very much an advocacy tool, and I'm hoping that it's also giving our professional colleagues more of a say, more influence within their organisations. So that, you know, and again, going back to that SIGO role being set up, it's so that the chief executive has to go and ask the chief information governance officer from time to time advice on a critical strategic decision. That's our aspiration. I confess, you know, I admit, I should say that, you know, there's still a way to go, but I'm quite pleased with the progress that we have seen.
Now, there's an anonymous question there, Julia.
Yes, that is a little bit similar as you. The policy statement could be applied more broadly across the profession. Do you see a benefit in that? And would the National Archives take up, and would a broader take up rather across the information professional be seen as positive? So again, this is the sort of the role of the National Archives and the policies that you reduce and that sort of impact beyond the federal space to other spaces. I know CARA has been working together very closely on a lot of these things that with the state and federal agencies together. But yeah, I guess that broader applicability of the policy.
Well, yeah, look, and I'm very brief. I'll go on after you.
Yeah, go
on.
Sorry. We said we weren't going to do this. So yeah, what we have found is that, you know, it does apply to the Australian government because that's our remit. You know, we can't apply the policy outside of our remit, but it is a good supportive tool. And what we found is that, and Julia mentioned CARA, that, you know, we were invited to present to an agency in Victoria and on the policy, and they found a lot of the policy principles to be helpful to them. So we presented to, it was a state government agency. Also in Western Australia, we didn't actually present, but we provided some greater insight to the policy to that organisation. Organisations such as the Digital Preservation Coalition based in the UK, but we work with them quite a lot about, you know, digital archiving practice and techniques. So we linked in with them, and they found the policy quite beneficial and useful across the board there. So we are getting a bit of take up.
Yeah. Well, look, I was just going to, I suppose, agree with that. I'm hopeful that it does. You know, look, I think, Julie, as you say, the National Archives of Australia, it's the best funded archival institution in Australia, in Australasia for that matter. And that does, and as much as we do need more funding, by the way, we can talk about that, but that does bring with it an obligation that we are doing something which is of broader use. You know, we have some public value. I feel it very strongly, our obligation to create public value, you know, beyond our sort of strict legislative remit. And I know Sue McCamish, you know, I'm not sure if she's joining us today, but Sue has always been very strong on this, that the National Archives has got a national responsibility, and I do feel that. So certainly what we do, we hope does have broader applicability, and we are always interested in getting engaged with those discussions as well, and providing whatever assistance we can and advocacy and influence we can to our profession more generally, and just to the health of administration across Australia. You know, as we've seen with the Royal Commissions, and, you know, this has got applicability well beyond just Commonwealth government. Yeah.
And I think that's important too, because, you know, even within agencies, just the sheer amount of resource intensity to try and meet all these needs. And that's the same across archival institutions across Australia as well. How can you join together? I think that's the big challenge within the digital space. And there are two areas I want to go into. One is the legislation, if we get time, but I might start actually looking at digital preservation, because I think that really is the big challenge. I often reflect on it. We've certainly been in Australia talking about this challenge for 20, 30 years, and it remains as difficult as ever, it seems to me. And I wanted to reflect for agencies, how do we, you know, you've got the focus on interoperability with that sense of moving through time, but the reality of, you know, a retention authority that requires something not as a National Archive, so not after 15 years transfer to the National Archives, but an agency to retain that for 50 years. How do you do that in the digital space? Are agencies set up to do that? Is this an area that National Archives does need to be leading the nation on in terms of it, in a little bit like the UK National Archives does and seeks to? Because it is complicated, and it's difficult, and there seems to me a lot of repeat effort going on incremental change.
Yeah, look, I reckon this is, this is the one thing which is probably takes the longest to explain. That congested landscape that Jason was talking about earlier. You can get so far into the conversation with, say, the Office of the Data Commissioner or, the DTA or Digital Transformation Agency, etc. And it sounds to everybody like we're all talking about the same thing until we finally point out the preservation. This preservation is the National Archives is the only party which is interested and looking out for actual preservation, preserving the utility, the usefulness, the accessibility of records. Everyone else across that landscape are interested in the here and now. They're interested in the transaction. Today we need to complete the transaction with this data. So we need to move the data from there to there, and your standards have to align. Only the archives, only us actually, everyone in the ASA, we're the only ones that are thinking about that interoperability over time. And so, yep, deep, it's certainly written into this policy is that obligation for preservation, that when you create information, your information policies have to contain policies on how will this remain readable, accessible, reliable over time? How will this survive one generation of technology into the next generation of technology? And that is the unique, that is in all the discussions we have lots of overlaps, but that area is the unique province of the National Archives in the Commonwealth sense. And so the question, how do we do it? It's we've got to make it as easy as possible for people to do it. So we do have to, keep publishing and, standards, data preservation standards, data format standards, which have got the best long-term chance. That one of the mandatory requirements in here is that 15-year transfer. As everyone will know listening, 15 years is a long time to wait for digital information. But nonetheless, we're pushing very hard for that. And if I could, I'm talking too long, but you did mention legislation before. We are advocating for new legislation, modern legislation for the archives, which would actually do away with this 15-year arbitrary period, but just to say, as soon as information is recognised to have archival value, it should be archived. Let's not wait even 10 minutes if we don't need to. So that's where we're heading on that. So I agree with you, Julia. There's still plenty of work to be done. There's a lot of conceptual, work that we have to do across the Commonwealth to convince people that data has got meaning, records have got meaning beyond, this election cycle. We have to think of the future. But that's part of the journey we're on.
Yes. Well, I was going to ask about the Archives Act and again, out of a number of reviews, the sort of sense of change and wondering where you think the Archives Act would be to support improved information management. So how it helps agencies as opposed to, say, maybe the National Archives focus, but perhaps that is one of them, that sort of ability to transfer records early. That's a very concrete one. I didn't know if you wanted to reflect a little bit more on this desire to change the Act and to modernise it.
I want to jump in on this 1 minute. So, yeah, we've got some urgent requirements to modernise the Act. So the definition of a record, I think everyone on this webinar would have heard me and Amber, we've all been talking about this, but, in the era of non-government platforms, and again, I bore people. I sound very nerdy when I start talking about the law, but it's how bloody Archives Act at the moment has got this definition of a Commonwealth record is the property of the Commonwealth. And it's just madness, in this information age, to have a definition which is based on property law, as opposed to, the realities of digital information and digital processing. Is just really, really holds us back. So the business of government is done on WhatsApp messages, it's done through Twitter announcements, it's done over Facebook. We have third-party non-government, websites and blogs, etc., etc. People use Gmail. There's any range of government activity going on, creating evidence of government activity which are not on Commonwealth stationary, or on Commonwealth systems. So definition of the record absolutely has to be done. I think we have to modernise those access provisions. You know, we have, I think everyone is well aware of the bottlenecks that we have around determining public access, declassifying records. We've got to bring that legislation up to date to try and find a more efficient way to do that, and to give the public more certainty as to what is made public and when. And also to take on board some more contemporary thinking about, is it as binary as that? So with the Tandanya Declaration, which I know we're going to be talking about in a separate venue, but that's sort of showing us actually it's not binary, you know, whether a record is public or secret. You know, there are communities which should enjoy access to records in a culturally appropriate way, which may mean you might consider it, you know, a first national, you know, record as opposed to a national record, if I can use that sort of word. So we've got to really, you know, engage with some of these more contemporary issues around what is public, what is private, and what are records. You know, what constitutes the evidence of our past.
Okay, and now we've got two questions here which we might turn to looking at time. And I think if any of the audience want to ask a question, probably this is going to be your last chance, so send them through. But Shirley's asked, given your aspirations for information governance to be brought into the boardroom, how do you feel that universities are going in providing suitable education for the profession?
Well, I don't think it's going very well. I think it's, you know, with some notable exceptions, I have to say, but yeah, it just seems to be, again, I just worry that information, look, and I, you know, full disclosure, I was a computer programmer. That was my tertiary education. I was a gun COBOL programmer back in the 1980s. But I do think information sciences is just predictably, you know, too dominated by, you know, sort of AI sort of studies or you know, studies of technology, you know, sort of technology for the manipulation of information, as opposed to genuine studies into how you evaluate the true value of information and how do we maintain and how do we amplify the long-term value of information. And I think, you know, as I said earlier, we deliberately use the word record, you know, in here, and I think, you know, we've got to win back the word archives. You know, really, what does archives actually mean, as opposed to what Microsoft might, you know, use the word to describe. The difference between an archive and a backup, you know, these sorts of things. So I think we have to do more there. And again, if someone's going to ask me, yes, we do have a role in that as well at the archives. I think we have to advocate for those sort of studies to be supported by universities. But that's my feeling. I think we're sort of, you know, losing ground on it.
And I think, you know, talking with you know, ASA and RIMPA have definitely identified with the tertiary sector, universities, there is becoming gaps there. That's where ASA have their training material, as does RIMPA, to fill that gap. One of our longer term aims is, David mentioned the Centre of Excellence, and us wanting information management to be a profession in the APS. It's really a 3 to 5 year time horizon, and yeah, that's also budget dependent. So we'll do what we can, but in the longer term, it is my vision is how can we partner with educational institutions in this space. So that's a longer term aim, but that's where we want to go.
Yeah.
It's probably a reality where they want to go as well, I would think.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, but universities are dealing with their own problems.
They have got a lot of resource constraints as well.
Now, perhaps it may end up being our last question, but Laura Miller has...
Hello, Laura.
Yes,
lovely
Laura, from us all. Well done, NAA, on an innovative policy instrument. Can you speak more about the nitty-gritty of guidance and support? What actions can or will NAA take to provide or help to agencies to fulfil their obligations for making and keeping records under the policy?
So what we've undertaken is that, you know, we as part of the initial release of the policy, there was well, if we step back, there's a lot of guidance material already on our information management page on the National Archives website, so people can go and have a look at that. When we released the new policy, we had a range of guidance material that we would provide in the first 6 months to the 30th of June, looking at various aspects. I won't list them all, but people can go on to the website and have a look at that. Then in each year, there will be some key areas that we will produce guidance, either updated guidance or new guidance, that we'll publish around sort of June each year. And that will be the guidance that we glean from our consultations, our feedback, where we link into various different forums, what can best help agencies to implement the policy. Each guidance material, and I know Esther, one of our key project managers in Melbourne, who worked long and hard on the policies with us as well, is when we publish the guidance material, we link it to which recommended action that we're trying to address.
Yeah, and maybe just very briefly, Julia, because Laura, you did ask about nitty-gritty, Laura. So, but there are quite practical low level, so business systems assessment framework. So if you are purchasing a software product for use in your organisation, we've produced an assessment framework to say, well, will this also accommodate sufficient record keeping requirements, as well as case management or a financial management system? Metadata standards, interoperability standards, these sorts of things. There are quite practical guides. Social media, how to maintain a proper record of dealing with social media, etc. So we do dabble in the nitty gritty under the very glossy, beautiful overarching.
So looking, we've got recommended action 13: create digital information assets in sustainable digital formats. We've got a born digital file format standard.